Welcome, everybody. My name is Mo Elleithee, and I am Executive Director of the Institute of Politics and Public Service here at the McCourt School. And I want to thank you all for joining this post-election analysis on the future of politics and policy as part of the Imagine the Future with McCourt series that really focuses on issues of the day and the groundbreaking research and forward-thinking work that is done here at the McCourt School. As an institute within McCourt, we at GU Politics are proud to be helping out with this event with our McCourt faculty and friends. I'm really excited for this all-star panel we have. Not only are each of our panelists brilliant political and policy minds, they all are affiliated with the McCourt School. And so I'm excited to introduce each of them. First, I want to introduce Jonathan Ladd, an associate professor in both the McCourt School and Georgetown's Department of Government. He serves in leadership at McCourt's Massive Data Institute, as well as at the Institute of Politics and Public Service. He studies American politics, especially the news media, public opinion, partisan polarization, and the loss of confidence in institutions. So welcome, John. Next, I want to introduce E.J. Dionne, a McCourt professor, a senior fellow at Brookings, a Washington Post columnist, a frequent guest on cable news, whose analysis of American politics and trends of public sentiment is recognized as among the best in the business. On a personal note, EJ was one of the founding fathers of our institute, really helping to drive its creation from the very beginning, and has served on our advisory board. So welcome, EJ.
Thank you, Mo, and you have done an amazing job with this. I feel like saluting you whenever I'm with you. Thanks, Mo.
You are too kind, my friend. For those of you that know anything about GU Politics, you know one of the hallmarks of our program are our fellows, where every semester we bring in a handful of political practitioners to work with our students on a weekly basis. So our next two panelists, I'm particularly excited to welcome. Mary Katharine Ham, who is currently one of our fellows, a CNN commentator and author, no stranger to presidential politics and presidential debates, having co-moderated an ABC News 2016 GOP presidential primary debate in New Hampshire. And she's been all over CNN this election, offering expert analysis. So Mary Katharine, welcome.
Thank you.
And last but not least on our panel, Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform and a former GU Politics fellow, an expert and advocate for tax reforms at the federal, state, and local levels, person who is no stranger to the political system. Grover, welcome back.
Good to be with you.
The person, though, no offense to any of our four outstanding panelists, but the person I'm most excited to introduce today is the person who I'm about to hand it over to, Naomi Lim. Naomi is a political writer at the Washington Examiner who has followed this election cycle diligently, reporting on the ins and outs. But Naomi is a McCourt alum, graduating in 2017 with her MPP, and was on the inaugural student advisory board of GU Politics when we launched a few years back. So as I was teasing right before we started, we are making history today with our first GU Politics and McCourt alum coming back to actually moderate a panel in her new role as an expert on the system. So Naomi, welcome back to McCourt and to GU Politics. I'm going to disappear now and leave this in your hands.
Thanks so much, Mo. It's good to see you outside a debate spin room. So we can convene here in this virtual space instead. I know that this event is about imagining the future, but I don't think that we can fully understand where we're about to go until we kind of think about where we've been. This election, not only this campaign, this election, now this transition, I think it's fair to say it's not what we expected. And so this first question is for Professor Ladd. I'm curious because I think one of the things that made this election a little bit sort of unanticipated was that the polls had President-elect Joe Biden up ahead of President Trump. So I'm curious to know what you think went wrong. And I know that there are a lot of pollsters out there who sort of think that the polling industry is dead. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the polling industry is not dead, but there are problems. It continues to get more challenging to do polls, and pollsters continue to develop new technologies to try to keep up with the challenges, right? So in 2016, there were problems. Nationally, polls were pretty accurate, actually. Hillary Clinton did about 1 point worse than her national polls, but some state polls in 2016 were quite inaccurate. This was not unstudied. The American Association of Public Opinion Research even did a big report on polls in 2016, and they're big. Long story short, you don't have to read the report, don't worry. But long story short is what it said is you need to weight your polls by education level. There are a lot of people without BAs who were just not interviewed enough in polls in 2016. So what happened this year? Well, this year, pollsters generally followed that advice and did weight by education. I think if they weren't weighting by education as well, we would have had worse problems. But even doing that, we had bigger polling problems this time. It looks like nationally, the polling average is a miss of about 4 points when it was about 1 point off last time. Donald Trump did about 4 points better nationally than the polls. Joe Biden's going to end up winning, it looks like, by about 4 points, and the polling averages had him up by about 8. Now, I think the honest answer is nobody knows quite why, and the reason, the likely answer is Donald Trump brings people to the polls, to the actual election polls, who don't answer polls enough. But it's not just low education people. There are some theories out there. David Shore, who's a political analyst, has this theory that it's low social trust people who don't trust other people or the government, who don't answer polls. And it's hard to weight polls by that, since we don't have social trust in the census. Like when it's an attitude that's causing people not to answer polls, it's harder to weight by it. But anyways, the polls got worse, and we're going to try to have to figure out why. I mean, the puzzle is it was worse in some states than others, just like last time. Like the polls are pretty accurate in Minnesota and Georgia, but pretty inaccurate in Wisconsin and Maine. And other places, and it's not obvious. And I think anybody who tells you they know they have the answer right now is lying to you, because there's some similar states where we had some misses and some similar to them where we didn't have misses. But it's got to be something where Donald Trump brought people to vote who just don't like to answer polls and turn down pollsters. And it's not just education, because even fixing that wasn't enough in some states this year.
So do you think that the problem will get worse if, let's say, social trust continues to erode, or will it be different in 4 years if, President Trump isn't on the ballot? We don't know that for sure, but let's say he's not. Do you think it'll be better or worse?
Well, my quick answer is I don't think we should assume that the same issue we had this time will be the same with Trump not on the ballot. I think it could be, and other Republican nominees for president might have a similar platform and similar positions. I tend to be, and maybe other people will disagree with me, but I tend to think to some degree in terms of his appeal and his media personality, Trump's a bit sui generis. Like there aren't a lot of people who have the profile and connect with certain portions of the electorate the way Trump does. It's going to be hard to replicate by another Republican politician. So I don't know. Trump clearly brought people out on election day who are unusual, are hard for pollsters to find, and not just people without BAs. I think it's going to be hard to replicate by other Republicans. Maybe they will. The future's hard to predict, obviously, but I think it's harder than people think. Any other Republican politician may seem more like another politician, but we'll see.
Could I quickly underscore something Jonathan said? I do think there is something sui generis about Trump, and the biggest mistake in the polls was the failure to anticipate that Trump would get 10 million more votes this time, where the count is now, than he did last time. And it was the same error in 2016. And I think it is that Trump seems to bring in voters who had been alienated from the political process, in some cases more extreme, in other cases just detached, and that the 2018 polls in the midterm were actually pretty good. So I think we have to look at the possibility that something very unusual happens when Donald Trump is on the ballot, because that was the big factor that was not predicted by anybody this year, is that big turnout.
But the Trump campaign will tell you that they spent a great deal of time and money. And whenever I'd go into a state, you saw them saying, we're out, we're doing door to door. We don't see the Democrats doing door to door. And they were projecting a certain level of turnout based on having ID'd voters, for 4 years now. They were handicapped by COVID because what they'd wanted to do is spend 4 months out doing those rallies and IDing all those voters. They did some of it online. I have no idea how much it's the same thing. But then when they got back out, just having people go door to door, they were projecting significant turnouts.
Yeah.
I just want to agree with that. I spoke to a Democrat in Florida who argued that one of the advantages the Republicans had was door knocking that the Democrats did not do. So I do think it's something, what you just said is almost certainly true in explaining some of what happened.
I talked to some of the freshman Republican congressmen and they said, you know what? People were really lonely and the Democrats made them all stay home for COVID. So we went to visit and talked them into voting for us.
Well, this is what I'd love to in Mary Katharine, because I know that, the way that this electoral map has changed is something that really is sort of interesting to her, and particularly the demographics. Did you want to speak to, EJ just mentioned Florida. Do you want to speak to some of this, the trends that we saw emerge this cycle?
I will add that, but I want to note on the polling front, I think as far as a sort of a journalism industry or a politics industry, the combination of the two, there are some obstacles to fixing this problem in the future, I think, and that's something that concerns me. And part of the issue, and this is a hobby horse of mine, so if I sound like a broken record, I will mention it again probably, is conformity in the industry and a tendency to have some groupthink and to not allow new information to change our conclusions or our narrative, right? So there was a moment right before the election when Ann Selzer's poll comes out in Iowa. Ann Selzer is sort of acclaimed as a very gold star, pollster in Iowa. She gets things right. Last time around, she got 2016 more right than many others. I believe she had Trump winning by a decent margin, maybe 2 points less than he ended up winning in Iowa, and everyone poo-pooed it then. And then once again, she comes out with her poll right before the election. He's 7 points ahead in Iowa, according to Ann Selzer. And because it was not with the other data that much of which failed us, everyone sort of spent 2 minutes hate on Ann Selzer on Twitter. And I thought, well, this is interesting. She did this well last time. She was 2 points behind Trump's performance. Like, let's look at this data and decide whether it does portend something in the blue wall states, whether the Rust Belt will act like Iowa this time around. Let's weigh that. And obviously, I don't want to overproject Twitter. Twitter's not the real world. But this debate about this one poll being an interesting fact was not about it being an interesting fact. It was about Ann Selzer sort of raining on everyone's parade when they had a blue wave coming. And so I think our inability to wrestle with those things might prevent us from fixing this in the future. And then reporters themselves, I think it's disconcerting when our data fails us, right? But then we have another tool, which is sometimes unfair, well, fairly referred to as anecdata, but it's also known as reporting, right? So you go out and you meet people, and there was a sense among some that the data does not seem to be lining up with the energy that I am feeling and the stuff I'm getting on the ground. And I, as a right of center person who was critical of Trump last time around, I didn't know anyone who had fallen off in my own personal life. And so I just thought, I feel like there's something else going on here. But if you didn't have that circle of friends, or if you didn't have that coming in or going out and seeking it, you wouldn't have gotten that information. So it was a real disconnect that I think can be possibly worked on by allowing those other forms of data and information to come in.
I mean, that's I think it's really interesting how you're sort of talking about you know, the anticipation of a blue wave. I think that's something that we didn't see particularly down ballot. EJ, did you want to talk about what you know, what we saw on election night, what that kind of means for the House and Senate, and particularly for the Democrats that, you know, campaign on a message, like different messages? EJ, did you want to take that?
I was disconnected from the internet. I want to apologize. My internet is unstable. I'll try not to be, but can you try to repeat your question because I lost you?
No worries.
Thank you.
So we were talking sort of about, you know, Mary Katharine sort of mentioned the possibility of a blue wave and how that didn't eventuate. What do you think that means now moving forward? Because I've seen a weakened a Democratic majority in the House and potentially, I mean, they still have the chance of getting the Senate, but it seems unlikely. What do you make of that sort of moving forward, and what it means for the Democratic Party, I guess?
I think there are two big lessons here that are more structural actually than ideological or big message. Thing one is that the votes for Senate, House, and President are now more aligned than they've ever been in recent history. Perhaps, you know, going way back, you probably have to go back 100 years to see this degree of straight ticket voting. And so as of now in the House, the Democrats on the current count have only lost like 4 seats that went to Hillary. They've kept about 2/3 of the seats they picked up in 2016 in Trump districts. But guess what? About half of those flipped to Biden from Trump. If you go back, the victorious Democrats in 2018 actually predicted seats that would shift from Trump to Biden this year. So straight ticket voting is very important. On the current count, Biden has, last I looked, 50.8 or 9, and House Democrats have, according to Charlie Cook's count, 50.4. I mean, it's roughly the same result. So I think that's one important thing that happened this year, and that the failure, just to go back to the polling, our view of what happened in the House was distorted by the fact that people didn't see that Trump wave coming, his bringing in new voters in the electorate. The second thing that's really important is that in 2018, Democrats brought everybody to the dance into turnout in a way that Republicans did not. If you compared the 2018 results with the 2014 results, the previous midterms, Republicans got 10 million more votes than they got in 2014, which is pretty good. But Democrats got 25 million more votes in 2018 than they got in 2014. And if you look at the census figures, the groups that turned out in 2018 that had the biggest bumps up were much more likely to be the college-educated constituencies that were shifting against Trump than they were the high school educated or not constituencies that were more pro-Trump. So a lot of what happened in the House is the complete overlap of the presidential vote with the House vote. I'm sure my colleagues will let them talk about some of the campaigns the Republicans ran. But I think the structural fact actually may matter more than any of the particulars that we take a look at here. And the last point I'll make is this majority that the Democrats have in the House now fragile in 2020? In principle, it is. And there are some seats that the Republicans could grab. But what's striking is the number of Trump districts that shifted to Biden suggests that the number of Democrats hanging out there may be smaller than we might think. But that's a long way away, so I'm not going to project. It's hard enough to project from the polls even after this election, so I'm not going to look to 2022.
I was going to ask what Grover thought about this, because I think that it's really interesting that Biden sort of is bragging about having brought together one of the broadest coalitions. And I was wondering whether he thought that it was a strong one, particularly because Biden did a lot of outreach with moderates and independents, and I'm wondering what that means for him going forward as well.
Not too much, because he can't govern that way given the nature of his House and Senate confers. What will happen, I mean, between now and 2022 is redistricting, and the Democrats wisely and very determinedly set about seizing the Texas House, the Senate in Arizona, the Michigan House, tried to take down some of the supermajorities Republicans have in other states, and failed in every single one. So they didn't capture a single legislative body. They didn't get the House in Texas. They didn't get the Senate in Arizona. The Republicans actually picked up both the House and the Senate in New Hampshire to go along with their governor, so they can redistrict that one state and pick up one House seat. Montana, which now has a Republican governor for the first time in 20 years and a Republican House and Senate, will redistrict what will be a two congressional district state in the future. And simply moving from blue states to red states as the population has shifted largely from the Northeast down south and Florida and Texas, there will be a lot more people in red states. Daily Cause wrote this beautiful rant that goes on for 20 pages saying that we've lost the House for a decade, and then go state by state and explain why. They had hoped, the Democrats had hoped, I'm told they spent $60 million in Texas and didn't succeed. $88 million showed up from other places across the country. I don't know what the total numbers are, but they were big. And certainly the Republican state legislators felt overwhelmed on cash, but they were able to hold those. So when you look at redistricting, not only will Republicans redistrict 4 times as many seats as the Democrats, but in Missouri, where clever Democrats put on the ballot, let's have this done independently and not bipartisan. Let's have I think it's the auditor do it. The auditor was the one statewide elected Democrat in the entire state, and that was put into the Constitution. That was taken out this election with an almost 2-to-1 vote. So Republicans will now redistrict Missouri rather than have the Democrats redistrict, a Democrat redistrict Missouri. So the challenges for the Ds are not only that they've still got all the 10 people who are now going to vote for Nancy Pelosi, who promised they'd never vote for Nancy Pelosi, and other 20 of the Democrats who were endorsed by the Chamber of Commerce voted for the PRO Act, which would make illegal right-to-work laws. That skated by because nobody saw anything other than Trump on the ballot this election cycle, but in 2 years and 4 years, that's not the case.
I would also add that in Virginia, did you watch this fight, Grover, where in Virginia, Democrats, when they were not in charge of the state assemblies or houses, activists brought forth this idea that we would have a bipartisan panel to redistrict instead. And then after they captured those houses, they were like, wait, no, maybe we're not into that, except it's on the ballot, and it passed. So it actually ends up taking that away from Democrats in this particular case. The principle won out, even though the people who pushed the principle from the beginning ended up not wanting it to. So politically speaking, that turned out badly for them in this particular case.
Yeah, so the next decade is going to be tougher for the Ds on the in the House.
I think the one, just a question on that, does the fact that Ds do have, if you look at states where the Republicans really drew very Republican lines the last time, you do have Democratic governors in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and in North Carolina. I know not every state has the governor as having a role here, but I'm curious if that puts a brake in rather important states on the redistricting. I'm trying to recall where the governor has a role, if somebody can help me on that.
Right. North Carolina, the governor does not have a role. In the other states that you mentioned, the governor would be able to veto, and you'll force it into a negotiation. So those, I'm not counting those as the 4-to-1 that Daily Cause was one where the Republicans will have complete control versus the Ds. And you're looking at the growing states of Texas and Florida as 2 of the bigger examples, but also North Carolina. And they just picked up the number of Supreme Court justices there, which also helps.
Yeah, my read on this had been that it was Democrats definitely didn't gain as much as they wanted to, and are definitely still in a weak position. It's not clear to me they're in a worse position. I'm not sure I agree totally with Grover. I'm not sure they're in a worse position than they were in 2011, when they were in a really bad, right after a disastrous midterm, mostly because of some gains they made in 2018. But they did not make further gains this time and are not in the position they hoped. I mean, Texas is a big one that would have made a big difference, and they put a lot of money into and did not prevail in the Texas House.
Well, I think
So-
Naomi, something I left sitting, which I apologize for when you asked me earlier, but is pertinent to this, is the idea that for Democrats that demographics are destiny, and like this thing is sort of wrapped up post-Obama coalition, and we'll just march ever forward with this amazing thing that we've built. This is the election where 2 times over with Trump, and have learned that like that's not exactly what this looks like, right? The argument has to be made to working class multiracial voters all over the U.S. I think, as you were pointing out, looking at Florida and Miami-Dade County and the switches that happened there is really fascinating, because I don't give the Trump campaign a lot of credit for strategy all the time, but in Miami-Dade County, they were down there investing in the Cuban American population and in other Latino populations as well, as we saw on these border counties that were heavily Latino in Texas. And I think Josh Kraushaar, who I think is a great analyst who's written for The Nation and works for Fox News, has said the future, as counterintuitive as it sounds to some of us who lived through the Trump era and the sort of the overweening message, the idea that the future of the GOP might be a multiracial working class party is interesting. And also, I think good for society in that it sort of it allows for the idea that we might not be quite as polarized along the same old lines as we thought we were, because there are people who are moving to the Republican Party and creating a different coalition than we saw before. And it is partly Trump's appeal that allowed that to happen. That's something that I have to sort of mea culpa for in my analysis. Is like I always said he's going to tank us forever with these demographics that we'll never be able to reach. And in fact, he spoke to them in a way that I don't, and in a way that that other Republicans on the ballot have not. Whether we can sustain that is a whole other issue, but I think it's actually it's a positive development for a lot of people, even though it doesn't feel positive for certain Democrats who are working in those areas. The fact that we are cross-pollinating in this way means that both parties have to speak to those issues and try to woo those voters.
Well, in California, they had that initiative where the Democrats, it wasn't an initiative, it was a referred question. The Democrat legislature put on the ballot, let's get rid of the ban on state-sponsored racism in hiring and education, where you can have racial quotas. So that was outlawed 20 years ago. And then they said, okay, it's time to get rid of that. We're going to run identity politics and everyone will love this idea. And they lost 58-42. The people of California voted down the Democrat proposal to maintain state-sponsored racial discrimination. They said that's gone. And that was a very significant vote there. And then in terms of wide numbers, and all the ethnic groups basically voted for it across the board. And then you had Illinois, where the Democrats said, we're going to have a graduated income tax in Illinois. They have a flat tax like 9 other states in their constitution. And they said, let's go to a graduated tax where we'll just tax the rich people more. That got voted down by the same percentages that Biden carried the state. So the idea of singling out the rich didn't sell in blue Illinois, and in Colorado, where the left groups all got together to do the same thing, they couldn't even get the signatures for it. The conservatives got together and put one that just took the single rate and cut it. That passed. So the initiatives tell a different story than some of the personalities, and from my perspective, a more hopeful one.
Look, can I come in on this? First, I obviously dispute Grover's description of affirmative action as state-sponsored racism, but we'll push that aside to argue about another day. I want to agree in part and dissent in part. Where I agree is the importance of Miami-Dade and what happened down there. If you look at Florida, if you look at Trump's margin in Florida, more than half of it came from the shift in Miami-Dade in the Democratic vote, where Trump, where Biden lost about 200,000 of Hillary Clinton's margin, and that accounts for more than half the statewide margin. And what's always been true remains true, which is Latino is a category that includes all kinds of Americans. It includes Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans and Cuban Americans, Venezuelans, Colombians, and particularly in South Florida, the anti-socialism campaign resonated with Cuban Americans, and I also think Venezuelans and some Colombians. But the Latino vote overall, and South Texas was the other place where Republicans made gains. On the other side, the Latinos were essential to Biden's victory in Nevada, essential to Biden's victory in Arizona, were an important piece of his vote elsewhere. It's not clear nationwide exactly how much the Republicans picked up among Latinos. I think we'll be arguing about that and trying to figure that out. But the Latino vote is definitely a mixed picture that we're going to have to look at for some time. And since Grover was throwing around referenda, the same Florida that voted for Donald Trump also voted overwhelmingly to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So I think in the end, we're going to, I agree, some of these referenda came out in a way liberals hoped they wouldn't, but there were other referenda, and I think that minimum wage increase in Florida is a significant one, came out in a progressive direction.
If I could just build on some of Mary Katharine's great points, I think anyone who did say demographics is destiny shouldn't have said that. That was never correct. Demographics is never alone destiny in the future of American politics, and one of the reasons are the ones we've mentioned, that there are a lot of different Latinos in the United States, and we've known for a long time Latinos in Texas vote a bit more conservatively than Latinos in other states. We know Cuban Americans in Florida vote a lot more conservatively than Latinos in other states. We also know that generally demographics are not destiny because, you know, a lot of things change as demographics change. I mean, we know that historically, in that the states with the highest non-white populations have been the states with the most conservative median voters in the United States for a long time, right? So southern states with a high proportion of non-white voters have voted very conservatively. So there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee
John,
that will change things. EJ, yeah.
I just want to interrupt. I mean, those states are the states with the highest degree of racial polarization. I mean, you're talking about Mississippi, you're talking about Alabama, and those are states where the white voters vote overwhelmingly Republican, and you've had racial polarization for 100 years. I think that is,
exactly.
You know,
thank you. That was meant to be my point. Thanks for explaining it better than I was. That's explaining it better than I was. I was implying that, and you explained it clearly. So thank you. That's great. And last thing I want to say is just like the trends we've seen on both sides. We don't know if they're going to continue, right? Biden did a little worse among Latino. It appears like Biden did a little worse among Latino voters than Clinton did about the same among African-American voters, and gained among suburban voters, probably among all races. It's unclear because we're looking at aggregates, not. And, you know, is that a Trump effect? Will that go back when a Democrat's not voting against Trump? Is it a product of Trump? Is it a product of Biden? You know, will the suburbs go back to where they were? Will especially, you know, Latinos without a college degree and African Americans without a college degree had some appeal to Trump. He's still losing those groups, but by less than other Republicans. Is everything going to go back to the way it was without Trump, or is that a trend? I think we don't know. At least I don't know.
Well, and there's also the question, as Grover's pointed out, whether, depending on who House Democrats listen to and national leaders listen to among their coalition, whether Democrats can change that trajectory or not. Because if you're trying to regain working class voters and you're, say, I don't know, putting college debt forgiveness at the very top of your list of things you want to do, that might not be the way that you stanch that flow.
So I would just like to pivot the conversation a little bit, because we have been talking about, I guess we're doing a post-mortem on the election, but for some of President Trump, including President Trump, the election isn't over. I would love to just dig into the election legitimacy issues that we're now facing, not only over the mechanics of the election, but now how that potentially affects President-elect Biden. I should have asked you this before, Professor Ladd, but there was a Monmouth poll that came out today that sort of talked about, you know, people's confidence in the election. I think about 60% sort of said that they were confident, whereas 30 didn't. Like, did you want to maybe reflect on that?
Well, to some degree, I mean, I don't know. I have too much to add other than what's obvious, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? So, voters, the losing side always, you know, is a little less happy with the election result than the winning side, and is more likely to some degree express preferences and that may just be expressing themselves in the poll. They don't really think the election was illegitimate, but they want to say that they're mad about the election. It's much higher this year, and it's obviously because Trump, I mean, he's a conspiracy theorist who's been a conspiracy theorist since, at least since he got obsessed with birtherism while Obama was president, and now he's, you know, on a conspiracy theory about the election, which is based on nothing. If Democrats, they did not, but if Democrats stole the election, they did a really bad job because they lost seats in the House and lost some Senate seats they wanted. So, you know, it doesn't make any sense on any level, and there's no evidence for it. But Trump's going to keep saying it, and he's probably going to keep saying it for no reason to think he's not going to keep saying it for years and years, and that affects a lot of Republicans. I do think opinions about the election may get less conspiratorial as we go forward. I think it's possible Trump's, one opinion I have, which I think is not a lot of people have, is that Trump's microphone is going to get a lot less louder and reach fewer people once he's out of office. I think he's going to have more trouble getting on Fox News, which is the biggest microphone he has access to. And it's harder than people think to just like start another network or take over one of the existing networks. I think the probability of him somewhat fading as a personality is higher, and thus people's faith in the election going up. But apart from that, what he's doing now is very bad and very dangerous, and you shouldn't undermine faith in the American election system.
But even if Trump had won this presidential election, everybody who talked to him would be looking over his shoulder at the next guy. I mean, they start that right away, even if you're reelected, if you're a lame duck. And if he's not even lame duck, he's the guy who was there before. I think you'll see people trying to I mean, there's a whole collection of people who might run for president, from governors to senators. They will all want their day in the sun. And so they'll be vying for attention on issues and helping other candidates and going around. It's interesting to see who was out campaigning for all the House candidates that might run for president someday. That started. So I don't see, I mean, Trump played a very interesting role in beating 6 Republican governors, Reagan Republican governors, who divided that vote by 6. And then he showed up with, 25 or 30% of the vote and took them all down one at a time. It was a very interesting strategy that wouldn't have worked one-on-one, but did with the plethora of guys running who all basically were the same candidate. I think now they're going to have to go out and every from Ted Cruz is going to want to talk about Ted Cruz, and Rubio is going to talk about Rubio, and the two governors, once and former governor of Florida, all want to be president. There's a lot of interest out there in running, and they're going to take some of the oxygen out of the room.
Could I say something? I want to underscore something Jonathan said at the beginning. There is no election legitimacy question. There is Donald Trump on the basis of no evidence saying he won an election he lost. And across the board, Joe Biden did far better than Donald Trump did 4 years ago. And Joe Biden has the same number of electoral votes as Donald Trump had. And what's disturbing is how few Republicans are willing to stand up and say, wait a minute, he lost the election. The votes were counted honestly. The attacks on the Georgia Republican Secretary of State are astounding. Here's where I think the long-term influence of Trump on the Republican Party is being seen. That when the Republicans won some of those Senate races and they won some of those House seats because of the vote that Donald Trump turned out on the right end of the electorate and on the disaffected end of the electorate. And so you have a Republican Party, I think, more dependent on Trump and Trumpism than it was even 4 years ago, despite Trump's defeat. And so Jonathan may well be right on the media. We'll see what happens when, we'll see if Trump loses Twitter followers, if people don't pay attention. But given the importance of Trump to the Republican base voter, I think it's going to be very hard for the Republican Party to ignore Donald Trump. And he's going to complicate the path for all of those Republicans that Grover named, particularly for his strongest supporters. If Trump wants to keep playing, he gets in the way of Tom Cotton. He might get in the way of Josh Hawley. And so I don't rule out Trump having a real effect, whether on behalf of himself or by affecting the nature of the Republican Party.
Mayor Katharine, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I was just waiting to make sure everybody's. No, I think a couple things. One, a lot of those senators actually ran ahead of Trump, so it's actually in both in 2016 and 2020. So they are psychologically dependent upon him in a way that's like not allowing them to speak. But the base really will react badly to that. Like let's be frank, that's what they're afraid of, right? And the question is how much your ticket to 2024 is dependent on how much you affirm what Donald Trump is talking about today, right? And it's bad. Because especially in Georgia, the hand recount and the audit, which were above and beyond what the Secretary of State was required to do by law, affirmed that like the discrepancies were almost nil. I mean, it's just handfuls of votes. They did quite a good job doing this, and it's interesting that everyone feels so out of sorts over an election that was, I don't want to say banal, but let's just use like a mundane sort of split decision, right? But we're all like freaking out over here. So I think the way that we consume the results is different from what actually happened. Moving forward, look, yes, the folks who want oxygen are going to vie for it. The question is whether Trump has the ability to sort of slap them down and whether they have to buy a ticket via Donald Trump. And as far as legitimacy goes, look, I'm going to be fighting this fight with people I know forever over whether this election was rigged or stolen, right? And if I may be frank, one of the reasons that conservatives or right of center people or people who feel disaffected have this feeling and are going to stick with it for a while, are going to process this for a while, is because they watched Democrats in 2000 say that Bush was selected, not elected. We've been hearing this our whole lives. This is my entire political life, like my political sentient life. They watched for 4 years after 2016, the media do 24/7 coverage on what ended up being not at all what they said it was, which was this giant global conspiracy and Manchurian candidate that we were going to get to the end of and unpresident the president that much of the media didn't like being elected by finding out that this was what he did. That's in fact not what he did. He has a lot of bad behavior, but that was not what he did. And a lot of that, I sat on so many of those panels. I talked about this for 4 years. And I kept saying, a lot of this feels like just an attempt to delegitimize a president that was elected that folks don't like. And we're willing to go down to a lot of roads and read a lot of facts as way bigger than they really are in order to feed that notion, because we don't like the results of this election. And it's dangerous on both sides. And I know everybody says that's whataboutism, but it's actually aboutism, because this is the delegitimizing an election for partisan reasons and for wanting to believe this fantasy is what we're talking about. And to that end, may I also say that making Stacey Abrams the queen of the Democratic Party after she refused to concede an election in Georgia for 2 years that she lost by a larger margin than Trump lost in Georgia, you can't stand that queen and then also say that this is very dangerous. So I will be having this debate about whether this election was legitimate with right-leaning friends and family forever, and I will be marshaling all the facts I can, and they will be telling me, but these people have been delegitimizing Republican presidents my entire life, and they have a point.
But it goes back to Reagan.
Reagan's coming out of the ear
with the Iranian mullahs to take over the country.
Look, steam is
Say,
coming
why
out
did
of the
police
ears of a lot of
conspiracy
people
theory on the
watching this
left?
right now. That absolutely is whataboutism. There is absolutely no factual basis, zero, for what Trump is saying. The
Where there
Russian
was when Reagan was
interference in the
conspiring with
election,
the Mullahs?
what?
It was factually based that Reagan was conspiring with the mullahs to win the election by holding on to
No,
hostages.
wait. What Mary Katharine mentioned was the Trump election, where our own CIA and the Mueller investigation clearly established that the Russians were intervening in the election to try to elect Donald Trump. That's not conjecture. And in 2000, yes, there's a big argument about whether the Supreme Court of the United States, 5 conservative justices, should have stopped the recount or not. Grover thought they should. I thought they shouldn't. That's a real argument based on fact. What Trump is claiming now has no factual basis. So I just don't think we can say, well, this is this and that is that. And yeah, I suppose people can feel it. But Mary Katharine, you can't. Are you saying they have the same factual basis?
No, I think there was slightly more factual basis for the Russian rabbit holes that we ran down for 4 years, but I think it was largely fueled by people's desire for this to unseat a president that they didn't like, particularly in media circles. And media circles have a lot of power to create. Look, I talked about it. I was like, I'm open to evidence, but I am not seeing a bunch that tells me that this Manchurian candidate run by the Russians, it was propped up, and I don't believe this Steele dossier. And I think perhaps, and something we should be concerned about, some of the law enforcement agencies of our country misused their power to investigate these people, something which has been confirmed with Carter Page and something we should all be concerned about. FISA reform, let's work on it. But nobody wants to be concerned about those things because that's the story they wanted to hear. The Russia story was the story they wanted to hear, and it delegitimized Trump, who had a ton of other bad behavior that you could use to delegitimize him. But I do think that these are of the same kind of tendency for partisans and people who wanted a certain outcome to undermine the outcome as it was. Those two are related. Yes.
Sorry to cut you off, but before we pivot to audience questions, I think it would be really good to just talk about, because we know that elections obviously have consequences. So it would be great to do sort of a round robin and take your predictions of what like the first 100 days or the policy priorities of the Biden administration will be. Professor Ladd, did you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think obviously, and maybe everybody's going to say this, but it's going to matter a lot how the elections come out in Georgia on January 5th. I mean, the path would be quite different. And I think Republicans are most likely to win that, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty about that, mostly because obviously Biden won the state, and we don't know how much Trump's ability to turn certain people out is replicable to a special election. So we don't know how special elections will, if they'll behave the way they normally have in Georgia in the past. Probably, but we don't know. Right. I think the biggest thing Biden can do without the Senate is foreign policy. Obviously, the president's freedom to operate is always the biggest in foreign affairs, both militarily and diplomatically. Trump's done a lot of unorthodox things, and Biden, there are a lot of things Biden would probably come in and try to reverse fairly quickly, restoring America's relationship with its traditional allies, as well as he can. Bring the U.S. back into the Paris Climate Accord, which I tend to think climate is the most important issue in the United States and in the world. So I think that's a big issue. That's a big thing for him to do. Obviously domestically, he's going to change a lot of policies, including restoring DACA and things like that. I think early on his biggest thing will be trying to kind of restore America's place in the world and restore internationally the way internationally countries take leadership from the United States. That has eroded somewhat in the last 4 years, and it's something that he has a lot of freedom to do regardless of whether he has 50 votes in the Senate or not. Obviously, if he gets 50 votes in the Senate, then there are a lot of things he could do. I think the first thing would be a renewed Voting Rights Act, which probably could get all 50 Democratic senators, if there were 50 Democratic senators, and definitely could get almost all Democrats in the House on board. And it was HR, essentially a version of voting reform was HR 1 after the 2018 election, and probably would be first priority this time too.
EJ, did you want to go next?
Do a national learn to count.
Mary Katharine, go ahead. Mary Katharine,
like from the beginning, national bipartisan learn to count quickly act, that would solve a lot of our social trust problems.
I'm with you there. I mean, Florida's good at counting votes, and New York's horrible. All states should get better at it. Yeah.
Mary Katharine, why don't you continue? I'll come in after. Go ahead.
No, that was just my only point. Go ahead.
So I basically agree with everything Jonathan said. A lot hangs on Georgia, and Georgia hangs on who the heck can turn out the most votes. It's a real turnout contest, I think, far more than a persuasion contest. I think that the central purpose of a Biden presidency for the next 2 years will be to conquer the virus and to restore the economy. And if he succeeds at that, I think he will be broadly seen as having a successful presidency. The word on the vaccines is promising and could be helpful. I think a lot will hang on whether Congress will enact some decent size, like large stimulus economic rescue really now, or later, because I think it's very important to give support to an economy that's still down 10 million jobs, where a lot of people are still suffering, facing evictions and all sorts of other things. And so more than anything, the Biden presidency hangs on the obvious. For the rest, I agree with Jonathan. If there is a Republican Senate, I think Biden's approach will be twofold. One, what areas might there be any possibility of agreement on? And obviously that elusive infrastructure bill that Trump kept talking about and never delivered. Do we still want to build things in our country with public money or not? That's going to be a big question. And so I think that's part of it. And then I think in other areas, Trump and the Democrats are going to try to make progress. I think Pelosi's House will still manage to pass a number of things with support from Biden. And I think one of the interesting things about 2022, if the Republicans control the Senate and try to kill a lot of this stuff, is when you have an unusual midterm where Biden is arguing against the do-nothing Republican Congress again. And will Democrats try to set up fights on certain popular issues like the minimum wage, where the Senate might not go along? But we got to see what happens in Georgia, because 50 seats is so different from 49 seats in the Senate. It's remarkable how important one seat's going to be.
Robert, what are your thoughts?
Well, if the Republicans take one or two of the seats in Georgia, the following happens. Guam does not become a state. There'll only be 9 Supreme Court justices. There aren't going to be new circuit courts. And you will have the tax cut kept in place because it lasts 10 years and the corporate rate reduction is strong. Biden's going to have a very strong economy as soon as Trump's vaccine gets out and the 95% effective vaccine takes this down. We don't have to lock people up in houses if you've got a vaccine. And as soon as the vaccine gets out and the various other vaccine approaches, you'll have that behind you. You will have the underlying tax cut. I mean, talking about unemployment, it's at 6.9%, 1% less than it was when President Obama got himself reelected. So the economy sucks, but it sucks less than the one the president ran on. So looking at what will happen, no $4 trillion tax increase, no tax increase, period. No $11 billion spending spree, no bailout of incompetent governors and corrupt mayors. The pensions will have to be paid for by people in those states and in those cities. And you could get there's a series of things you could compromise on, or that would be seen as compromise bills if you want. You could do more criminal justice reform. You can do immigration reform. There are Republican votes there and always have been to do something reasonable on DACA. We built the wall, which is what we're going to trade for DACA, so we can go and do DACA. You get half the Republican Party or more voting for some sort of DACA reform. And frankly, the business community and farmers want more immigration for workers. And the high-tech community feels the same way. So there's a tremendous amount you can do. The challenge is really good laws that both Democrats and Republicans can agree on are often not called laws. They're called hostages. Because as soon as you decide you want to legalize marijuana, the crazies in the Democratic Party in the House start adding all these things to it, and the boat sinks because they asked for all sorts of things that have nothing to do with legalizing marijuana. So you could legalize marijuana, but not if the left decides to turn it into a social warrior thing and add up everything on top of it, and then the boat sinks. So basically, Biden will be unhappy because we're not going to let him raise taxes. We're not going to let him spend more money. And on foreign policy, he'll let the Germans build that pipeline with the Russians so they can become dependent on Russian gas. He won't send stuff that kills people to Ukraine. He'll go back to giving them food or something. There are a whole series of zones where, and hopefully, he will take most of Trump's tariffs or taxes, tariffs or taxes, tariffs or taxes, and get rid of those. The farmers would like that. The business guys would like that. Consumers would like that. Whatever it did, it didn't force the Chinese to do what we wanted to do. It'll be interesting to see what certain parts of organized labor do who kind of liked some of those tariffs. But Biden has tended to be more open on those issues. And all of the promises that NATO made on funding more of the defense of Europe will go away because Biden won't care.
I just will let all that sit there because it's astounding, but there's so much about that description that is quite astonishing. But
Biden's going to go yell at the Europeans and make them pay more. When the president did that, people called Trump bad names and said he was being mean to NATO. He's really going to, he's going to make them live up to those commitments?
I think it's
I don't think so. You could be right. I think it'd be a good idea if he did. I'd be surprised.
Yeah, Jonathan, I leave it to you. I'm just going to let all that sit there. Go ahead.
It's just a list of things that are going to happen, guys. These are no wild predictions. It's just, this stuff is going to happen. I'm not letting the guy raise taxes. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I'm fine.
Now, one of my favorite things, it's a double-edged sword. One of my favorite things that Trump did was bring out the free traders among Democrats. So I'm happy to see that. I do think there are things that potentially they could work together on. I think sort of the liberal base likely is wary of Biden's desire to get with his buddies in the Senate and come up with some stuff that would not be super left. I do think if to marry EJ's and Grover's points in an unlikely way, it could be that a Republican Senate saves the liberal base and saves Democrats from their liberal base, because there's only so much you can do, and they will not be able to accomplish things that might, I would say, for instance, a tax hike might slow down economic recovery, right? I do think in the near term, what Biden exactly will come into January 20th, and I'm heartened that he does seem to be being able to go ahead with transition in ways that will make him in a good position to address these things when he comes in. I am genuinely worried about this spike in COVID and what the holidays look like and what this crisis looks like when he comes in January 20th. And one of the things, there's great news about the vaccines. One of the things we have to wrestle with is on both shutdowns and vaccines, we have a public trust issue again, right? And making sure that messaging is very smart about that and addressing people's concerns and not being, I think, unfortunately, during the run up to this, because it's Trump's vaccine and it was Operation Warp Speed, too many people flirted with anti-vax rhetoric who would not have normally, because they were like, I don't know if we can trust it because it's Trump's project. And now that we have, obviously we all knew these were real studies, this is FDA-backed stuff, that messaging is going to be really important when he comes into office, and making sure that as many people take it as possible. And rebuilding trust in public health officials is going to be part of this battle. It just is, because one of the issues is with lockdown stuff, and I don't know what Biden's policy will be. But with lockdowns, people are tired, they're dispirited, they've had many, many things taken away from them. And then they see, yes, people who are in power and elites doing the things that they're not allowed to do. And it makes them go, is this real or is this not? Like, are you guys full of it because you're going out to French Laundry? Are you guys full of it because you went to a protest when I'm supposed to be sitting at home? So that took a toll that I don't think enough people are dealing with. And in order to actually solve this problem, you have to repair some of that trust. And Biden may be the guy who can do it.
I think Biden modeled this behavior for which he got a lot of grief all during the campaign. Biden was basically doing exactly what you said leaders should do at some cost to himself, because everybody would say, get out of your basement. The Democratic campaign, as we talked earlier, took itself off the door knocks because they were trying to be true to this. So yeah, that Gavin Newsom should not have gone to French Laundry, but that has nothing to do with what Biden is doing. And just to answer Grover in a brief way, Joe Biden will do something very important to our foreign policy. The United States will be again friendly with democratic nations, small d, democratic nations that we have been aligned with traditionally, people who believe in liberty and equal rights. And we will be far less cozy with authoritarian regimes the way President Trump has. That's why I think on Grover's point, will the Europeans continue to pay for defense? Yes. I think Biden will have far better relationships with European allies. And I don't think a president who cozies up to dictators is something to celebrate just because the Europeans started spending more on defense in this period. And that's going to be a change for the better for our country, some of which I suspect in his heart of hearts, even Grover would acknowledge.
Well, when you look at what happened, what did the Soviets want? What did the Russians want? They wanted to have Europe dependent on their energy. The fight against that pipeline, that the Nord pipeline that Trump has continued, I don't believe will continue under Biden. You could prove me wrong. That would be very helpful. It would be very wise if he did that. But that comes at the cost of irritating the heck out of the Germans. They will be very unhappy to be told they can't do that. And the other thing the Russians would like us to do is stop fracking. And the damage that was done to Russia by having the fracking at the level it did and us becoming energy dominant, but being significant energy players and getting more natural gas out, made Russia irrelevant. The cash they don't have, the cost to them of the low price of oil makes them non-players in much of the world. I mean, it's very, very debilitating to them. And the idea that Trump was nice to them strikes me as an odd comment. They don't see that. It damaged them tremendously and continues to. Now, you take stop fracking, as Biden has said 15 times, but other times changed his mind. You can see it on our website, all the 15 times he said he's going to ban it. If he reduces fracking and the amount of exploration, as Obama did on federal property, but couldn't get on state and local property, you'll see the price of oil go up and the Russians will be happy, very happy.
So
Yeah,
we're coming. Sorry,
Can
we've
I
already.
change that a little bit? I was not a Trump voter, and this is something on foreign policy where I was like, maybe my least favorite thing about him is the inability to have moral clarity about dictators, right? That's like, I would just sit there in awe of some of the things he would say. Like, this is not how we do business, and it's not how we encourage free people in other places, right? But then he comes with these weird benefits. And EJ is going to be like, no, what benefits are you talking about? But I actually firmly believe, even though I was not a Trump supporter, that his approach to the Middle East is what brought you these peace deals that really matter. And everybody said, if you move the embassy to Jerusalem, all hell's going to break loose. If you do these things, like, this is not the approach that will work. And yet, if you get out of the Iran deal, all hell's going to break loose. And yet, you do have this burgeoning process going on that broke with the status quo because he broke with the status quo. And I do worry as a former sort of like young, naive, more pro-nation building interventionist kind of Republican, now sobered by having lost friends in the Middle East and and going through all of that, I'm like hawk-ish now, right? As opposed to a hawk, which was I was before. I do think that Americans have been war weary for a long time for a good reason, that Trump sold that message and mostly stuck to it with like flares of bellicosity that frankly I appreciated when various things happened. But I do think if Biden is in the mood to go back to a more traditional approach or Obama approach on foreign policy, that the voters may not like it as much as Democrats think they will.
I do think Trumpism on that foreign policy issue, the Republican House and Senate is more war averse than they would have been in under Bush. I think sobered up or whatever it is, but it's less likely to be hawkish. The one question I have for the Biden people is whether they'll continue the executive order that puts religious liberty at the top of American values when we deal with other countries. That's been very expensive in arguing with China. The previous administration bought China's argument about what was happening in the Uyghurs and put it into their State Department report. This president has taken a different attitude towards that. And given his early attacks on Muslims everywhere, I thought his highlighting of the Uyghurs and the Rohingya has been extremely helpful. And I hope that Biden can continue that, even though it means having the Chinese mad at you.
I think we're out of time, but I would just add, I think in big picture, the thing Russia geopolitically has wanted for a long time is to divide a wedge between the United States and Germany so that they could have more and divide that alliance so that they could have more influence in Europe. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did for them, which is threatened to pull troops out of Germany and ruin and drive downhill our relationships with Germany, which is what Russia has wanted for decades and decades and decades. And I think the biggest consequence of pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal is that Iran's building nuclear weapons, and at a much higher clip than it was before. Whatever you think it was doing before. And a consequence of us pulling out of the free trade agreement in Asia, right, is now Asian countries are now building a free trade agreement and relationships with China without us. So I think it's left us on the outs in a lot of ways. I agree with you. I don't think we should be involved in overseas wars. I think we should have fewer troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. It's not clear to me before. It's not clear to me Trump made tons of progress on that. But
and John Bolton reported Europe with Asia. I think you'll see a lot of Republican support for going back towards what Obama put together.
John Bolton reported that what Donald Trump said to Xi about the Uyghurs is great. He endorsed it. The notion that this administration, this current administration, did anything to help the Uyghurs is just contradicted by the record. And in terms of the human rights and religious rights, I think what Biden will do is strengthen our commitment on religious rights by rooting them in a much broader commitment to human rights around the world. And that's going to be the debate we'll have, and that'll be a good debate for us to have.
Okay, we'll see if he keeps the executive order.
So as Professor Ladd pointed out, we have run up against time and we might not be able to get to any questions, but I do know that there's one specifically for EJ from an old friend. So I'll get that to you offline. Thank you. So are there any final thoughts, or we can wrap it up now? I think that we've sort of touched on lots of different things, and I think that by the diversity of views here, it sort of, I think, foreshadows the difficulties that not only this administration but the parties and like the body politic will have moving forward. And there's
I would like to say that first of all, thank you, and I'm sorry for filibustering question askers, but it's so on brand for all of us. So
look, and on that note, I want to thank all of you, Grover, EJ, Jonathan, Mary, Katharine. I mean, for the members of the Georgetown community who are watching, I mean, this is the kind of conversation that we have every day at GU Politics and at the McCourt School, showing the diversity of ideology here, the fact that it can get feisty but remain civil. That is very much on brand, and I want to thank all of you for showing that. To Naomi, thank you so much. Congratulations on all of your success since graduating a few years ago. Thank you for moderating this conversation and doing it in a way that I'm actually in awe of. You let the panelists talk. Too often we don't get to do that. We don't get to actually hear a free flow of ideas. And so thank you for that. And for the entire audience, please continue to watch the work at McCourt and at GU Politics. You can sign up for both newsletters, mccourt.georgetown.edu or politics.georgetown.edu, to learn more about the experts in research and events that are constantly ongoing here. So with that, I want to thank everybody once again for sharing part of your day with us, and until next time, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
That's good, Mateo.